Good afternoon, students. Let me welcome you to the session for Environmental Education EE31. My name is Mr. David Sampson, and I will be your tutor for the session. We are going to talk about in this session especially the issues on environmental education and what the course content covers. But please remember, this is not a scope for the examination. This presentation is to guide you in relation to what topics are covered, and then also how you need to prepare your questions for the assignments as well as the examination when it comes to submitting assignments and then preparing you for the examinations for environmental education EE31. So the first aspect that I want to focus on for this session is the issues related to the three sections which is covered in this course. As you know, your course covers three different sections, that is geography, history, as well as biology. It's a lot of content to be covered within one course, but if you prepare yourself properly, then obviously you will not have any difficulties throughout the year, or for example, or preparing yourself for the examinations also. Now it is important that you, for your assignments and your examinations, to look at or observe the level of questions or questioning that is required for the assignments as well as the examinations. It is also important that you understand what the questions requires from you as a student when you read the question, by focusing on the key words used in the questions. For example, you can be asked to describe, you can be asked to explain, you can be asked to name or list or state. So obviously those are the different levels. If you are asked to list, obviously you are not going to describe. If you are asked to explain, you are not obviously going to mention. So you have to describe, you have to explain what is required. Now it is important that you read your questions correctly for all assignments, all examinations, in order for you to answer the questions correctly. I have mentioned this in previous examinations reports as well, that students make many mistakes, especially when answering the questions in the assignments or the examinations. And the problem usually comes in when students read the questions incorrectly, and then obviously they will answer the questions incorrectly. It is important that you also write neatly or clearly in order for me to make out what you are writing. Sometimes it's very difficult if you don't write clearly or neatly, especially also grammatical errors. Try to avoid or cut out these grammatical errors when you write your assignments or when you write examinations. It's important that you answer what is required. If you do not answer the questions, you will obviously not be rewarded. So it is important that you answer your questions properly, because you lose a lot of marks if you don't do that. Other aspects related to the assignments and the examinations is important to make sure that you read the instructions on the question papers, answer all questions, strictly follow the numbering of the questions on the exam papers as well as the assignments as it appears, especially in the question papers. Check the allocation of marks shown in brackets after each question. These questions range from 1 mark questions to 10 mark questions. When you are not sure about an answer, you move on to the next question. You can always come back to that answer. To the question if you are not sure. But don't get stuck on one question for 10 minutes. It will frustrate you, so move on and then you can come back. You can always go back to unanswered questions. Leave them, go on, and then go back. The geography section is the first section which covers a lot of content, and the content is around the aspects of geomorphology, especially earthquakes and volcanoes, where you have to understand the difference between earthquakes and volcanoes, difference between divergent boundaries and transform fault boundaries, the environmental impacts or the effects of volcanoes and earthquakes, especially on people and the environment. You also have to know what strategies can people put in place to reduce the impact of earthquakes and volcanoes, especially on people. The section also covers issues around global warming. If you look at past exam papers, you will see that there are questions centered around global warming, especially the effects of climate on natural vegetation, the main factors which affect climate, the strategies that can be used to manage the effect of earthquakes and volcanoes, as I've mentioned before. And then there are also content which is covered like erosion and weathering. You have to know and define what erosion is, what weathering is. It's important to know those concepts as well, because it tests your conceptual understanding, meaning that I can ask you to define, for example, a concept like erosion and weathering to test your understanding. It can be done in an assignment or it can be done in an examination. It focuses also on basic types of weathering. You know what those basic types of weathering are? Can be chemical weathering, biological weathering, the difference between climate and weather. What is your understanding of the definition of climate? What is your understanding of the definition of weather as well? The hydrological cycle, mostly referred to also as the water cycle, is important. You have to know what the hydrological cycle is. You have to know the factors which affect climate, and then the effects of climate on natural vegetation. So if we can go back, then you would basically, this is what this section covers. It is not everything, because this is just a presentation. So obviously you will have to study and prepare the section very well in order for you to be able to answer any questions that comes your way in an examination. Obviously the assignment is not a problem, because you can refer to your guide when you have to answer questions on the section using the guide. But make sure that you don't copy directly from the guide, because you also have to answer these questions as much as possible in your own words. Like I've mentioned previously, this unit covers content, it covers concepts. I've explained to you and I've mentioned to you, you can be asked a concept like weathering, then you have to provide the meaning. You can make yourself a little table like this one, where you split the table in two, indicating the concepts and then the meaning. Starting with weather, compaction, volcano, earthquake, geomorphology, erosion, desertification, or global warming. Usually towards the end of your study guide, I think you have noticed that there's a glossary of terms which is provided after each unit or section, and that is very useful for you, especially when you need to prepare a table like this one for yourself, when you prepare yourself for the assignments and examinations. It is actually good to start with this kind of table very early in your studies and make yourself the tables where you write down your concepts and then explain your meaning of the different concepts. There are a lot of sample questions that you can use in preparation for your examination. You can always look at some other exam papers it will actually help and assist you when you prepare yourself for the exam. And you can also look at the way that these questions are phrased. For example, you might be asked to define the following concepts, meaning that you have to give the meaning of concepts. It can be on a concept like geoformology, it can be a concept of erosion, a concept compaction, weathering, climate, etc., etc. These are not the only ones, this is just a few examples. You can be asked a question on global warming, for example, where you can be asked to explain how the earth is heated. You can be asked to analyze or describe or explain the stages of the water cycle. You can be asked to explain the environmental impacts or effects of volcanic eruptions or earthquakes. You can be asked to differentiate between a volcano and an earthquake, meaning what is the difference between an earthquake and a volcano? Or you can be asked to describe strategies that can be used to manage the effect of an earthquake, or you can be asked to describe strategies that can be used to manage the effects of a volcano. So you have to remember that there's the strategies for volcanoes and the strategies for earthquakes. Some other sample questions can be mentioned. You must mention the main factors which affect climate. Mention the factors of soil erosion or soil formation. Explain the 3 basic types of weathering, and identify the weather instruments that are used for measuring air and sea surface temperature, measuring atmospheric pressure, measuring humidity, measuring wind speed, measuring liquid precipitation over a set period of time. As you can see, this last question is referring to weather instruments. Those instruments that is used for different measurements, measuring air, measuring atmospheric pressure, measuring humidity, measuring wind speed, measuring liquid precipitation. So you have to know which weather instruments are used for these different types of measurements. Now, if I can just draw your attention to the illustrations. The illustrations that I have here is illustrations that can be used in an assignment or an examination paper. As you can see that the focus in exam papers is also using what we call diagrams. So a diagram is just referring to a picture. It can be this one or it can be this one. Now, as you can see, this one is, you have to identify it in order to know what it is. We know that this one is referring to what we call a Stevenson screen. So it's important for you to know what is in this weather box or the Stevenson screen. Or you can be asked to identify the diagram, or you can be asked to measure the instruments that one find in this specific weather station. This one, obviously, if you look at past exam papers, you will see that this one, this diagram has been used in order to test your understanding, for example, of a specific hydrological cycle, which is precipitation or rain. So this is basically examples of diagrams that can be used in the examination. Okay, if we move on to the next section, it is actually the history section. Now, what I want to pay your attention to is the fact that a lot of students, the majority of students, lose a lot of marks in this section. It seems like they focus only on geography and biology. And this is where a lot of students lose a lot of marks in the examination, because this section is usually poorly answered. I don't know why, but it is just one of those things. So it is important that you pay also enough attention to this section as you pay attention to geography and biology. Don't become selective when you prepare yourself for the examination. It's important that you give equal weighting and attention to all the sections in your studies. The history section covers issues around South African occupation of Namibia in 1915. Obviously, you have to know the reasons why South Africa occupied Namibia in 1915. South African colonial administration from 1945 to 1979. The development of Namibian nationalism. The apartheid, the concept of apartheid, what is the meaning of the concept apartheid, as well as the laws introduced and how it was structured, and the effect of the apartheid system in Namibia or on the people of Namibia. Especially for the DPP students, the issue of apartheid is discussed thoroughly around what it meant and how it affected the Namibian people. There's also content related to the role of the church on the road to independence. Various political parties established to resist apartheid in the country. When you have to know who those political parties are and their role in resisting apartheid in Namibia. There's content around on African struggle for independence and economic development, especially for the DJP students. The Organization of African Unity. You have to know what the organization was all about, how the organization was structured, what was the function. World history in the 20th century. Peace treaties after World War I. The Cold War in Europe. Especially what was also the meaning of the word Cold War. The founding of NATO, the founding of the Warsaw Pact. Why were the two organizations found? The League of Nations, as well as the United Nations. Now, students, you have to pay particular attention to the two that I've mentioned last, which is the League of Nations and the United Nations. You have to know how these two organizations were structured. Don't confuse the one with the other. It's important that you know what was the successes and the failures of the League of Nations and the successes and the failures of the United Nations. Sometimes when you ask a question on the League of Nations, like the failures or successes, students turn it around and then they mention the successes and the failures of the United Nations instead of the League of Nations. So it's important that you don't make those kind of mistakes. I've mentioned peace treaties earlier, so it's important that you also know and understand the effectiveness of peace treaties. How effective were they in terms of preserving peace? Sometimes you can be asked, do you think that the peace treaties preserve peace? If you say yes or no, you have to explain why you say no and why you say yes. I've mentioned the League of Nations, the body that made up the League of Nations, the weaknesses, failures, and successes of the League of Nations, the UN weaknesses, the successes of the UN, and then the different wars and their consequences. We had, for example, you know that we had the Vietnam War, and you have to know what were the consequences and the effects of the Vietnam War, especially for the DPP students. The DJP students, you know that you are not covering the Vietnam War, but you are more covering the Korean War instead of the Vietnam War. I've mentioned the Cold War and the meaning of the Cold War. You have to explain what the meaning of what the Cold War was all about. And then I also mentioned previously that it's important to know why was NATO and the Warsaw Pact formed after the Second World War. The same applies with the history section, where you have to know some concepts and their meaning. Make a table for yourself again, where you write down your concepts and what the meanings are. After each section, as I've mentioned for geography, there's also a glossary section where the concepts are explained towards the end of each of the units in your guides. There are a few sample questions as well. As you see, these are the kinds of sample questions, or questions that you can expect in examination. So you also need to be aware of the levels of the questions. You can also refer to previous exam papers, because exam papers also give you an idea of the different kinds of questions that might be asked or can be asked, or possible questions that you can expect in an examination or even in an assignment. There's a few other sample questions as well. So if you look at them, you would notice that they are on different levels, testing your different levels of knowledge and understanding. The next section is the biology section. The biology section is also covers a lot of content, like geography, and it's important that you, in your preparation, that you work early at the beginning of the year, working through these sections, section by section, and then focusing on the different topics, as well as distinguishing between concepts in the section, as well as the content-related issues of the section. When you read through these sections, you obviously also get an idea of defining some of the concepts as you go through the content. The section focuses on the study of mitosis, meiosis, and the difference between the two. Obviously, I think you are now aware of, you will always be asked to differentiate between the two. Asexual and sexual reproduction, the advantages and the disadvantages, the difference between the two types, the issues of sexual reproduction in humans with reference to the male and female reproductive systems, male and female, and the function of each structure. Describe the role of hormones, the effects and function of hormones in the male and female body, the role of estrogen and testosterone, the female sex reproductive system, labeling of male and sexual parts. When I talk about labeling, I'm referring to illustrations where you can be given an illustration in order to label or identify them. Let me show you an example again of a diagram that can be used in this case. For example, on this side you have the female reproductive diagram, the male reproductive diagram, and there you have the female reproductive diagram. If you look at previous questions where this type of diagrams were used, usually you are asked to identify or label the parts like A, B, C, D. You are given you are given A, B, C, or D, and then to label, meaning that you have to explain, identify A, which part is A, which is B, which is C, and which is D. The same with the male reproductive system, and the same with this one. So these are examples of possible diagrams that you can be asked in an examination or even in an assignment. Okay, as we go on, the section also focus on certain concepts, as I've mentioned. They are there, especially the ones that is both covered in both content for the DPP as well as the DJP course. The question on DNA, what it is, how it is structured, and what is the function of it. Seed disposal, global warming, conservation, and then also some concepts which you might be, you might be asked in the examination, where you have to either differentiate between the two. You can be asked to differentiate what is the difference between a genotype and a phenotype, between ecology and ecosystems. So after each section in the biology section, you also get a section with glossary or concepts, which is prepared for you, just to make it easier for yourself when you look at that. Okay, I've mentioned the issues around diagrams because we usually use them to enhance your understanding, and as well as testing your knowledge around these diagrams. So it is not just a question of giving you a diagram and wanting you to label them, but also important that you know what these diagrams, what they actually show and what it means. The diagrams can show visual aspects of a fetus inside the uterus. If we look at this specific one which I've showed you, you will see that this one in the middle is the one showing the fetus. So this is the fetus inside the uterus. So obviously you will also have to know how it is structured. And then, as you can see, it shows the different parts, like the female and male reproductive system is also doing. It shows different parts inside the fetus, inside the uterus during pregnancy, or it shows the parts of the male or the female reproductive system. So what it actually requires from you, as I've said, is you have to label the structures and then explain the functions of each of the structures as labeled in each of the diagrams. Okay, there we have them. So this is just an enhancement of the previous one which I have shown you. And then it's important that you understand the male reproductive system, the different parts and what is the function of each part. I have given you a table, for example, where I've indicated the sperm duct, for example, where you have to know what is the function of this. And there are 3 examples of 3 of the different parts of the male reproductive system. You can make yourself a table like this also for the female reproductive system, or for example for the fetus, where you write down the male reproductive system, the part as well as the function. The same for the female reproductive system, the part and the function. Okay, those are the diagrams. There are some examples of sample questions that can be asked. These questions usually are, if you look at the previous exam papers, you will see that there's a lot of example questions on different levels which can be asked when it comes to setting the exam paper or setting assignments and the type of questions that you can expect. You will see that they differ from explain to describe, differentiate, and then a question F, for example, which of the structures on the diagram is responsible for the following: making sperm, passing semen into the vagina, carrying sperm from the testes to the penis. Those are also questions that can be asked on a diagram, for example. You can be given the diagram in the examination, and then you can be asked questions on the diagram. The same as with question G. And then explain the role of the placenta, differentiate between the two types of reproduction. Discuss the importance of conservation of the natural environment. So I've given you a few sample questions that you can also use and work through, especially when you need to prepare, for example, for the examination. Like I've said at the beginning, this is not a scope. This is just to guide you in terms of what you might expect, especially on the content to be covered, as well as questions that can be asked in relation to that content that is covered in each of the different sections. Yeah, so we have come to the end of this presentation. If you have any questions, you can contact me by email. Email address is indicated, as well as mobile, especially between 5 and 8 in the evenings. I thank you.